So I just wanted to thank everybody for letting me Zoom. Um, it's snowing here. It sounds like the weather's better there, but I said I had a friend that called me this morning and said, I hope you're not driving to East Aurora because the roads aren't very good. And then I also said that at the risk of oversharing, I was a little bit secretly hoping that the whole service would be Zoom because I like to be part of things. And now that I see all of you there in the sanctuary, I feel a little left out and jealous that I'm not there in person. So, but thank you for letting me do this. So we're good. Everyone can hear? Okay. So I think it was the summer of 1970, and my mother had gotten a Singer sewing machine with plaid stamps. Remember plaid stamps? And she took an 8-week sewing course, and she made each of my sister's jumpers as her first project. And my older sister Janet was going to be in a fashion show at Holy Family High School, and they were going to make the entire outfit. I think part of the requirement for this fashion show was that you make the outfit. So you had to make the whole thing yourself. And one of the items they decided that they were going to make was a cape out of this sort of heavy tweedish fabric, which was lilac color, as I recall. But think about it, it was 1970 after all. So in order to make the cape, my mother needed a buttonholer. Now, who knew that sewing machines needed such attachments, but apparently they did. And my mother was going to go out and buy a buttonholer when she mentioned it to her friend Kathy. Oh, don't buy one, Kathy said. Linda Latin has one. She just offered to give it to me last week, but I already have one, so I'll call her for you. So Kathy arranged for my mother to go and pick up the buttonholer. And it was going to be a little bit of a trip. Linda lived way out in the country near Locke, New York, which is maybe about 30 minutes from Auburn, where I grew up. And for the House family in 1970, I think I've mentioned this before in another sermon, but that was a big trip. My father used to get the oil changed for our trip to Syracuse once a year to buy school clothes. So this was kind of a big outing to be going on. And when we would take that school trip outing, my grandparents would come over and say goodnight to us, goodbye to us the night before, and make us promise to call when we got home. And because it was such a risky venture. So venturing beyond the Auburn city limits, anyway, was not something that we did very often. Nor was it something that we did without great care and a fair measure of trepidation. I mean, God knows what could happen to you when you ventured past the traffic circle at the lake. We had just watched the drama of Apollo 13 unfold a few months before on television, hadn't we? See what can happen to you when you venture too far from home? So it was summer vacation at the time, and so my mother had to bring all four of us. Not that she minded. A journey on unfamiliar roads like that was much less scary when you had some companionship. And even Janet, who was about 15 at the time, decided that she would make the journey with us. The buttonholer, after all, was for her fashion show. Now, in spite of all of my familial predisposition to stay as close to home as possible at all times, I was excited for this excursion. I mean, I had never been that far down Route 34 before. Who knows what I might see? I had looked at our AAA New York State map, and I learned that Route 34 went all the way to Ithaca. Imagine. I never expected to travel that far, of course, but we would get almost to the Tompkins County line. This is definitely going to be an adventure. I was 7 years old, and my younger sisters were 6 and 5 at the time. So this counted as a trip in our minds. We each brought our favorite stuffed animals with us for the journey, and we pretended that we were on a train to New York City. We brought along a bag of candy and refreshments, and we pretended that our stuffed animals were bringing the candy back with them from the dining car. We had just, after all, watched the episode of I Love Lucy where the Ricardos and the Mertzes take the train back home from California. So we considered ourselves experts on train travel. We got as far as Scipio Center, which is a little hamlet outside of Auburn. We got as far as there without a hitch. I'd heard of Scipio Center, but I had never been there. What a thrill it was to see it for the first time. And we were just about to enter Genoa, I think is how most people pronounce it, when it happened. Suddenly, a huge quantity of steam began to rise from the hood of the car. "The engine's on fire," Janet shouted. "It is not," my mother snapped back. "The engine is just overheating." As we pulled over to the side of the road and my mother turned the engine off, we all just kind of sat there. And as I have often said, also, my younger sisters were, and in some ways remain to this day, the poster children for drama. So they both instantly burst into tears. "We'll never see our home again," they kept wailing. "Cut it out. You're being ridiculous," Janet scolded them. "We're only 20 miles from home." 20 miles, they both wailed in response. "How will we ever get home?" Now, my mother was trying her best to stay calm. But as I have said, our family was extremely travel avoidant. We were 20 odd miles from home on a fairly deserted country road. And of course, this was long to the fact that she knew she had to stay calm because she, after all, was the mother. She was flustered and she herself was not sure what to do. "Daddy always opens the hood to let the steam out," Janet said helpfully. So my mother went out and she tried to find the latch under the hood, but it was too hot and she almost burned her hand. "Let's just let it cool," she said irritably. "We'll never see our home again," my younger sisters wailed again. "Oh, will you stop it, you two?" my mother said. And then she turned to Janet. "I think I'm going to do this. You two stay here. You stay here with them, with the little kids, and I'm going to walk down the road and I'm going to find a house. I'll call Grandpa and I'll have him come and get us." She was just about to leave when suddenly a person appeared with a big bucket of water. The person was probably 5'4" with a slightly stocky build. The wrinkles in the face suggested that this person was at least 70 or so. They were wearing a very loose-fitting denim shirt and a pair of very baggy khaki pants and work boots. The person also had long gray hair that was held on top of their head with two great big combs. "I know what to do," the person said. "Just sit tight." And they carried the bucket of water to the front of our car. And then they reached into their pocket and they pulled out a red bandana, which they used to unlatch the hood. "Stand back," they said firmly as they unlatched the hood and opened it up. Enough steam shot out that for a second or two it obscured our view of the engine. "Gotta let it cool," our rescuer said patiently. "How far do you have to go?" they asked my mother while we waited for the engine to cool off. So my mother explained about the buttonholer and Linda Latin, and she even explained about the fashion show. Our new friend seemed amused by the whole story and by my younger sister's dramatics, but the person didn't say much in return other than to muse, "You certainly have your hands full with this bunch." We were all transfixed by this person who was helping us out. Was this person a man or a woman? Of course, none of us said anything then, but we were all thinking it as we watched them in fascination. "They're a man," I'd decide, and then I'd look again. "No, this is a woman." I was changing my mind every 30 seconds or so. It was fascinating. I had never before encountered an individual who I couldn't instantly categorize as either male or female. I mean, just what gender were they? Everyone is either a man or a woman, right? You have to be one or the other, don't you? The very first day of kindergarten, the first thing they did was divide us all up into boys and girls. We went to gym in the cafeteria in two lines, a boys' line and a girls' line. There was a boys' play area and a girls' play area. There was a girls' bathroom and a boys' bathroom, boys' toys and girls' toys, girls' clothes and boys' clothes. Even bicycles were made differently for boys and girls, and you better make sure you were riding the right kind if you didn't want to get made fun of. I mean, that's how the world works, right? You were either a boy or a girl. So was this person an old lady or an old man? This person had to be one or the other, right? After a few minutes, the engine cooled down enough so that our friend was able to unscrew the radiator cap and pour the bucket of water in. but they noticed that something was amiss while they were doing so. "Hold on, I'll be right back," they said. And it was only then that I noticed that we were, in fact, right in front of a small gray house that was almost completely hidden from view by trees and overgrown shrubs. So while we waited for our friend to come back, my youngest sister, Catherine, who was only about 5, finally whispered, "Mommy, is that a man or a lady?" "Shh, shh." My mother silenced her instantly. "Don't ask questions like that." A minute later or so, our rescuer appeared with a wrench and tightened some of the fittings on the radiator. When they were done, they said to my mother, "Start it up." My mother started the engine, and our friend put their hand up like this to silence us. "I have to listen," they said. And after listening for a minute or two, our friend said, "You should be fine now. Drive carefully," and began to walk away. My mother got out of the car and said, "Thank you so much. I don't know what we would have done if you hadn't been here." Our friend didn't even turn around. They just simply put a hand up and said, "Think nothing of it. We all need to be neighborly when we can." And with that, just as suddenly as the person had appeared, they disappeared back into the thicket surrounding the house. We all got back into the car and resumed our pursuit of the buttonholer. No one said anything for a minute or two, and then my little sister Catherine asked again, "Mommy, was that a man or a lady?" "Well, I'm not really sure," my mother said. "Well, he fixed our car," my sister Joan said, "so he must have been a man. But he had long hair up in combs like Grandma Carey wears," I said, in spite of the fact that our friend had displayed this mechanical prowess. So I had decided that she was a woman. "But she didn't have any bumps," my sister said, a bit self-consciously, indicating breasts. "Well, she was wearing a loose shirt, so you wouldn't have seen them," my mother said. She was leaning toward female as well. "But he acted just like a man," Joan said. And it was true, there was a certain masculinity to the way this person moved and talked. Now, Janet, the teenager, didn't say anything while we continued to speculate about the gender of our rescuer. Again, it was 1970, and Janet was a teenager, a very artsy, hip teenager, quite enamored of the whole hippie, peace and love ethos of the era. She listened for as long as she could. And then, with all of the teenage girl attitude that she could muster, she snapped at us. "Oh my God, enough already. What difference does it make? Maybe it was a man. Maybe it was a woman. Maybe it's someone who doesn't think of themselves as either a man or a woman. Can't people just be who they are?" My mother paused for a moment, and then she said kind of pensively, "I guess you're right. I guess it really doesn't matter, does it? We were just curious, that's all. We've never met anyone like that before." "Well, neither have I," Janet said, irritated, "but I don't have to go around putting a label on everybody." And as soon as she said that, I remember being impressed. I was too young, of course, to understand all of the politics and social justice issues that she and my parents argued about constantly as adults and teenagers did in that era. But I nonetheless resonated with her open and accepting attitude. We don't need to put labels on everyone, was my big takeaway from that conversation. But that doesn't mean that I stopped trying to classify everyone I saw as either male or female. Like most of us, perhaps all of us, it's ingrained in my psyche to do that. I do it without even noticing it or without even thinking it, without even trying. Whenever I encounter a new person, my brain wants to decide which category this person belongs in, male or female. Yet, in spite of how automatic it is for most of us to do this, I don't necessarily believe it's natural. Rather, I believe that it's a learned behavior, conditioned into us by the culture that we live in. And not only have I come to believe that it's not in our nature to categorize people in this narrow and binary fashion, I don't think it's natural for us to think of ourselves that way either. I think we are all just born as who we are, with our skills and our talents and our interests and our tendencies, and society forces us to adapt ourselves to fit rigidly into an artificially binary world. And in the process of making this adaptation, each and every one of us, in some way or at some level, has denied or stifled authentic and marvelous aspects of ourselves. We've always lived in a non-binary world, and I believe we've always been, to an extent, non-binary ourselves. When I was little, for example, I loved women's shoes. Every Sunday after church, as a treat, my mother would let me wear her high heels. I liked playing house. I liked playing dolls. But I also loved cars and tractors and trucks and anything with a motor and wheels. It was only after I went to school and endured the forced binary segregation of girls and boys that I ever thought about which of these interests was appropriate for boys and which ones weren't. Before that, they were just the things that I liked and that I was drawn to. I remember in kindergarten being extremely adamant that I would not wear boys' sneakers. They were ugly and rugged looking, and they just didn't feel like me. My mother managed to find a pair of those tennis shoes, kind of like the ones that Mr. Rogers wore, which looked neither boy nor girl, and that's what I wore for gym class until I was in about 4th grade. When I was about 7, I went through a phase in which I was fascinated by pregnancy. I wanted to have a baby in the worst way. I used to stuff pillows under my shirt and walk around pretending that I was expecting a baby. And by 7, I knew that what I was doing would be frowned upon if anyone else knew about it, so I did it in secret. I was starting to adapt to the artificially binary world that I lived in. When I first went to high school, I used to carry my books up like this in my arms, like this, supposedly like a girl. And I often sat with my legs crossed, supposedly like a girl also. And then one day, I heard some kids making fun of Robert Martin, a boy who was considered very feminine. They specifically mentioned the way he carried his books and the way he crossed his legs, and that he did both of these things like a girl. So being an insecure adolescent, I immediately began to carry my books down at my side like a boy, and I trained myself to sit with my legs apart and both feet on the floor rather than crossing my legs. No more crossed legs for me. I was going to be as masculine as I could. I was going to make sure that as much as I could, I fit into the binary world. I am betting that most of us have had some experiences like this, some childhood memories of not being completely conforming to the binary expectations of the gender we were assigned at birth and being shamed in some way or another for it. Boys don't do that. Girls aren't supposed to do that. What's wrong with you? Well, in recent years, many of our friends and neighbors and family members and loved ones have begun to identify as either non-binary or as a gender other than the gender that was assigned to them at birth. It feels like a new phenomenon, and it is new in a way. It isn't new in the sense of its existence. It's always been a non-binary world, and we all, to some extent, come into the world as non-binary spirits. What is new is that finally a critical mass of our beloved community has begun to claim and own and celebrate this reality. They no longer feel the need to deny and stifle and hide natural, beautiful, and good aspects of who they are. They've stopped worrying about how they carry their books or how they inhabit their bodies, or how they are characterized by others. They are pushing back against the unnatural, contrived binary sort that categorized most of our childhoods. They are challenging the notion that everyone can or should or even needs to be able to fit neatly into one of only two possible boxes. They are calling attention to the pain and the self-denial and the self-loathing that so many of us have felt at times because we couldn't or didn't want to fit ourselves into one of the two categories that we are all conditioned from birth to believe that everyone does and can and must fit into. They are claiming their birthright to be their authentic selves. And in so doing, they are making the world safer for all of us. They're making it safer for each and every one of us to be completely and utterly and joyfully our authentic selves, whoever that is, and whatever feels right to us. It's a win-win for every single human soul. In recent years, thanks to my brave friends, I honestly have started to wonder how my life and my identity might be different if I had been born 30 or 40 years later. Would I have worried about how I carried my books in high school or how I sat on a chair? And much more importantly, would I have become a more authentic and gender fluid person than I am if I had gotten even a glimpse of this possibility? This past summer at the Rochester Church, I was asked a few times why we felt the need to list everyone's pronouns at the start of the service. In Rochester, I introduce everyone who's taking part in the service today, and I say, this person, he, she, this person, they, them. And I got some pushback from it from a couple of people. They wanted to know why it was necessary to do that at the beginning of every service, or why in the emails that people sent out or in the newsletter, people listed their pronouns. What I said in response was this. First, we are all conditioned to think about others in totally binary terms. He's a man, she's a woman. Taking the time to list everyone's pronouns trains our brains to stop just doing that automatically. It's an important reminder to all of us that there is, in fact, an entire spectrum of possibility when it comes to gender. And it helps to treat everyone as if they may be somewhere on that continuum other than where we think they are. It helps to teach the lesson that we can't always assume that we understand a person's gender simply by their first name or by their physical appearance. Additionally, it's an important act of inclusivity and justice. Non-binary people are being vilified all over the nation right now in our political footballs in political campaigns. Their lives are being played with and shamed for political gain. And there are some real consequences to that. The world is a dangerous place for our friends in that position right now. They are at the center of some of the most vicious political culture wars. So when we take the time to list everyone's pronouns, we're taking a stand for justice. And we are sending a strong message, an important message to our non-binary friends that they are not only welcome in our Unitarian Universalist congregations, but that we welcome them as their full and authentic selves. In the same way that we made most of our church buildings accessible back in the 80s and 90s for those with physical limitations, our listing of pronouns makes our community more accessible to and more inclusive of the non-binary. And it reminds us as Unitarian Universalists who we are. Every time we go to the effort to list another person's pronouns, we're saying it matters to us that our community is inclusive and open and welcoming to everybody. And this morning, I will add one more reason. When we take the time to consider and name pronouns, we are reminding ourselves that it's okay, that it's perfectly fine for each and every one of us to be our full and authentic and self-defined selves, that we ourselves don't have to fit into a box or a category. It's permission for everyone who identifies as male to cry and show tenderness whenever it feels natural. It's license for every person who identifies as female to show as much strength and assertiveness and competence as they want. And it's an affirmation to those who don't identify with either gender. It's a message of empowerment to every human soul that reminds us that we are born to be nothing other than exactly who we are. Some people here may have met over the years or known my ministerial mentors, Mark and Donna Morrison-Reed from the First Unitarian Congregation of Toronto. Well, by their own self-assessments, each one of them embodies many of the qualities associated with a gender other than the one they identify as. Donna is strong and unsentimental and fearless and at times unyielding. Mark is soft and warm and nurturing and sensitive. And when I worked with them in Toronto, they were constantly musing on how non-traditionally they lived their roles. I would see them both at work, and when I visited their home, I would notice how much their parenting styles diverged from what the culture would have expected. But I didn't fully understand it completely until one afternoon when I was chatting with Mark. The Toronto church had two ministers' offices. The big one was occupied by Donna, and then the small office was always shared by Mark and the intern. So Mark and I were talking about marriage and parenting and kids, and in the course of the conversation, he told me that one of the saddest days of his life was the day that their son, Elliot, stopped calling him mommy. It was the first of what would be many intrusions of the artificially binary world into the heart and soul of this loving and well-functioning family. And it's, in its own way, a small tragedy. Because in a better, more authentic world, I could easily have seen Mark buying a buttonholer and making a lilac-colored cape for his child. Thank you all for letting me join you on Zoom today. And you saw for a minute my cat Anna wanted to join us briefly, so she says hi as well. Thank you.